of starting on time and having enough time for discussion. We have a excellent panel today, and thank you for being here so early. I expect the room to fill up as the day goes on, but I think among the different treatment arms that we offer, chronic opioid therapy is still a big part of that. So we have an excellent panel here today, comprised of Dr. Florit, Dr. Candido, Dada, myself, Dr. Casasolo, and Dr. Benjamin. We're going to go a little bit out of order. So in keeping in mind a major part of our pharmacotherapy, Dr. Candido is going to start off with history of the opioid epidemic in America. I know Ken for a very long time. He's informed, concise, and to the point. There's a lot of content in his talks. And without further ado, Ken, Dr. Candido.
Thanks, Chris. Does this clicker work? This clicker works. Good morning, everybody. Thank you all for coming in. Actually, history is probably a good place to start when we talk about the opioid epidemic, at least the current opioid epidemic. I'm going to leave you with a couple of bulleted messages today. One is that I'd like you all to recall this term, other synthetic narcotics, because it's going to become very important to you as you navigate through the morass of information that the lay press puts out. And I'm not going to talk about fake news per se, but there's a lot of misinformation about the opioid epidemic. So we have a very, very lengthy history of the opioid epidemic in America, and I'm going to take you through it and tell you what I believe to be the actual fundamental reasons for this. The other take-home message I'm going to leave you with is a new term that you've never heard before, FOFAT, F-O-F-A-T, because FOFAT is really the reason why we have an opioid epidemic in America. I have no disclosures as they relate to this learning activity. I do have learning objectives, and in simplest terms, my learning objectives are that you comprehend how the opioid epidemic had its origins in America, past, present, and future. What are our future directions? Most of you have heard about this governmental branch known as Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, right? ATF. If you think about it, ATF was a branch of basically of the military, which was created in 1886. And how would we lump together three disparate concepts, alcohol, tobacco, and firearms? They've got nothing to do one with the other. Well, in point of fact, they do, because this is part of America's addictive behavior. Americans are addicted to alcohol, we're addicted to tobacco, and we certainly are addicted to firearms. So as I prepared this talk today, I said, that just doesn't go far enough. I know that ATF added explosives recently, so it's ATF plus E. But I think what we need to do is to really reconcile what America's all about in 2019. I think we are FOFAT. We're addicted to firearms, opioids, food, alcohol, and tobacco. And so I'm going to propose to the American government that we change ATF to FOFAT, and those little jackets that they wear and the little hats they wear should not say ATF, they should say FOFAT. Now, am I over-exaggerating things? Absolutely not. In fact, we spend an awful lot of time either killing people or putting people in jail because of our addictive behavior. And what we reconcile in this country is that by doing so, we haven't solved the problem, right? We can chase Escobar, and we can chase El Chapo through tunnels, and they can escape, and we can shoot them on rooftops. But we haven't addressed the fact that Americans are in love with opioids. So let's talk a little bit about it. How long have we had an opioid epidemic for? Anybody think that our opioid epidemic started in the last 10 years? Show of hands. How about in the last 25 years? Show of hands. How about the last 150 years? So in 1804, Frederick Turner, a 21-year-old pharmacy assistant working in Austria, was able to isolate morphine from opium. This was a major advance in the annals of modern world medicine. But it was in 1853 that we were finally able to use this medication for something other than oral administration. And at that time, so before that we had laudanum, which was a highly addictive preparation of opium. We had very, very little else before Sir Turner's work in his laboratory in Austria. As a pharmacy assistant, he wasn't even a full-fledged pharmacist. And here's Sir Turner, 21 years old, really a brilliant young kid, made a great contribution to modern medicine. And then Alexander Wood, who was from Scotland, developed the hollow syringe and needle. So finally, by 1853, we had a mechanism available to administer either intramuscularly or intravenously very potent analgesic medications. And what does 1853 correspond to? Well, it was right preceding the American Civil War of 1861 to 1865. Now remember, in 1861, we didn't have mass media, we didn't have cell phones, we didn't have television or radio. We had newspapers that took about a week to print, and we had very, very poor record keeping. But statistically speaking, it has been suggested that there were 400,000 American soldiers, both addicted during the war as well as after the war, to morphine. In fact, morphine use was considered to be soldier's disease. Not only the deadliest war in American history, by far, 620,000 deaths both on Union and Confederate sides, but also 400,000 opium and morphine addicts. That's an estimate. So again, morphine use was called soldier's disease. It was also known as Army's disease. And so C.R. Alderwright, who was in Great Britain, looked at this American phenomenon across the Great Pond and said, whoa, those guys over there are getting addicted in droves to the use of morphine. I'm going to look at this compound. I'm going to create something which is more salubrious, which is more beneficial to health, which resolves diarrhea, colic, helps with sleep, and also is a potent analgesic, and it's not going to be addictive. And he created heroin, diacetylmorphine. And so obviously we know historically that was a grave error in thinking, but he was a brilliant scientist who tried to do something because of America's burgeoning opioid epidemic problem. And in point of fact, the Bayer company that you all know, if your grandma has Bayer aspirin on the counter, you've all taken it at one time or another. The Bayer company made their fortune not through aspirin, but for a 15-year period from 1898 to 1913, they made billions of dollars selling heroin. And so we know a lot about morphine, we know a lot about heroin. In fact, the great Halsted, who was the founder of Johns Hopkins University and the father of modern American surgery, in fact, many of his surgical principles are still in common use today, he was one of the most notorious cocaine addicts in the world, and he was shipped by Johns Hopkins all the way over to Austria, where he met with some of the minions of Sigmund Freud, and Freud actually used morphine to cure cocaine addiction. And so that's called switching addictions. More on that later. First pain clinic in 1935 by the great John J. Bonica from the island of Filicudi, right off of Sicily. I knew Bonica very well. I actually anesthetized his wife right over here at the Lenox Hill Hospital in New York City many years ago when Stephen Opsbaum, an ophthalmologic surgeon, repaired a botched eyeball surgery she had in Seattle. And he was the forefather of modern interventional pain management. So in 1875, we had the first laws in this country aiming at stemming our burgeoning opioid epidemic. And what were those laws geared towards? Well, it was actually racist law against the influx of Chinese who came into California, into San Francisco in 1849 for the gold rush. You've heard of the San Francisco 49ers. And 1869 to build the Transcontinental Railroad. Well, when the railroad was finished and when there was no more gold to harvest, the Chinese stayed. And this was creating a scourge to the good citizens of San Francisco, right? We knew that they had opium dens. There was gambling, prostitution. There was human feces littering the streets of San Francisco. Sounds just like today. Nothing's changed. And so the first drug laws were actually created to try to eliminate this opium scourge. In 1906, you could buy opium, morphine, marijuana, and heroin from the Sears Roebuck catalog. Here's an excerpt taken from the 1906 Sears Roebuck catalog. So what changed? Well, in 1914, Representative Francis Burton Harrison, a Democrat from this great state of New York, right next door here, created the Harrison Act. And Burton Harrison was a very interesting guy, married 5 times. He was the governor of the Philippines. And he said, you know, we have to start to tax the production, the distribution, and the sale of opioids and cocaine products in this country. Before that, there was no federal regulation. Notice that Harrison died on the very same day I was born, in the very same hospital I was born, but I never met him. So in 1980 and 1986, there were 2 landmark articles. And why are these articles important to everybody in this room? Because they were the foundation for the modern opioid epidemic. And how did that happen? Well, in the New England Journal of Medicine, there was a letter to the editor by Herschel Jick and Jane Porter that basically said that patients in the hospital who use narcotics legitimately don't get addicted. In 1986, Russell Portnoy, Kathleen Foley from New York, stated that the chronic use of opioid analgesics in non-malignant pain, things like low back pain, in a small series of 38 patients did not lead to addiction. Now, why were these two articles landmark? Well, because the pharmaceutical industry took this information and ran with it. Reps from Purdue Pharma and other manufacturers started to go into little mom and pop doctor offices across the country saying, look, we have peer-reviewed literature that says that the reliable, responsible use of opioids does not lead to addiction. Here's the letter to the editor from Jane Porter Herschel Jick. Almost 12,000 hospitalized patients were assessed retrospectively. Only 4 cases of legitimate addiction related to the use of narcotics in the hospital. And what did they say? Development of addiction is rare in medical patients with no history of addiction. Russell Portnoy, often been credited as being one of the progenitors of our modern opioid epidemic, although he's taken great steps to try to backtrack and isolate himself from this. Actually, the American Pain Society, which recently went belly up 6 months ago, did so because of some of his protestations about their opioid policies. And Portnoy in 38 patients said that opioid maintenance therapy can be safe, salutary, and more humane alternative to the options for surgery or no treatment in patients with intractable non-malignant pain. So now we've got these peer-reviewed articles, we've got the drug manufacturers taking this as gospel and going from hospital to hospital, from shop to shop, telling us that we had to prescribe opioids to our patients. Obviously, the Wall Street Journal published an expose on Dr. Portnoy that he disclosed relationships with more than a dozen companies, almost all of which produced and manufactured and distributed opioids, and he made many hundreds of thousands of dollars lecturing on behalf of the opioid industry. So what's happening presently? That's just a quick overview. It's hard in 20 minutes to tell you really all I know about the history. But what's going on presently? Well, in 2007, this should have been a harbinger and a wake-up call for Purdue Pharma, but apparently it wasn't. 3 of their top executives were indicted, and they paid a hefty fine of $634 million, which was about a fourth of their total revenue for that year, which was $2.8 billion. Their CDC guidelines came out in 2016, which were geared towards primary care physicians. This is the Purdue Pharma headquarters in Bristol, Connecticut. Many of you know the Sackler family, which owns Purdue, or which owned Purdue. They're going now bankrupt. They have created a wing at the Guggenheim Museum here in New York, but they're being ostracized, right? They used to be socialites here in New York, running in the highest social circles. Now they can't get a burger at McDonald's on Fifth Avenue. They're being ostracized for their contribution to the opioid epidemic. The Joint Commission, which tries to limit its complicity in the opioid epidemic, must take responsibility for this primer, which was published in the 1980s. And this primer stated that clinicians have inaccurate, exaggerated concerns about addiction, tolerance, and the risk of death. Now, who funded the Joint Commission to publish this primer? Purdue Pharma. So what about the rest of the history now in present time? We know that there are a lot of opioid prescriptions being written every year, every day, every week. We know that there are a substantial proportion of patients who have addictive disease and disorder. We know that anywhere from 88 to 134 people die per day in this country due to drug overdoses. I'm going to show you the latest CDC statistics about this. Now, the most glaring statistic is that Americans, we have 325 million Americans. We constitute 4.4% of the world's population of 7.2 billion people. And we consume anywhere from 68 to 79% of all the narcotics in the world. That's called a mismatch. 4.4% of the world's population, and we consume 75% of the world's population. In fact, we consume almost every molecule of hydrocodone in the entire world each and every year. And this has gone on since the year 2000. We consume a little bit less oxycodone. I'm going to show you how this factors into our decision-making on the present opioid epidemic. What about illicit fentanyl and derivatives? I told you at the onset of this discussion that one of the key take-home messages was the use of the term other synthetic narcotics. So we know that what's killing people in droves is not the prescription writing from individuals such as us in this room, from our colleagues across the country. We're small part-time players in the opioid epidemic. What's killing people are what's coming across our borders from Canada and Mexico. And as much as you may dislike some of the policies of our President Trump, his border control policy is actually having a surrogate effect of trying to limit the influx of methamphetamines and fentanyl into this country. In fact, in February 2019, James McDonald, the Assistant Secretary for countering weapons of mass destruction, classified fentanyl as a weapon of mass destruction. Now, is fentanyl a weapon of mass destruction? Go back to 2002 in Moscow. In 2002 in Moscow, there was a hostage siege. A group of Special Purpose Islamic Regiment terrorists held 900 Moscow theatergoers hostage. And Spetsnaz didn't know what to do to liberate these hostages, so they called the United States FBI. FBI didn't know what to do, so they called Dr. Theodore Stanley at the University of Utah School of Medicine. Stanley was also known as Dr. Fentanyl. He created the fentanyl lollipop. He was very instrumental with Paul Janssen in creating carfentanil, low-fentanyl, remifentanil, sufentanil. A genius, a billionaire, somebody who knew how to do things and get hostages liberated. And Stanley said, let's put a couple of drops of fentanyl in the ventilation system. And what you're going to do is you're going to anesthetize everybody in the room. You can rush in and save the hostages. Well, point of fact, the rebels, the terrorists, had gas masks on, so this didn't really affect them, but it killed over 130 of the hostages before they were ultimately liberated by Spetsnaz. Now, Americans love narcotics, but they also love amphetamines. So actually our prescription writing for amphetamines has skyrocketed much more than it has for opioids in the last several decades. Let's talk about this statistic. 70,000 people die per year in the United States of America from drug overdoses of all drugs. You could fill up Giant Stadium, MetLife Stadium, once a year with 70,000 football patrons and kill them all, and that's how many people die from drug overdoses. But look at this statistic. It's other synthetic narcotics that's killing patients at an exponential, accelerated rate. It's not the prescriptions that we write. It's other synthetic narcotics. Narcotic drug overdoses in this country, almost 50,000. That includes fentanyl in its narcotics. But if you look at these statistics, it's not prescription writing that's killing patients. From 2012 onward, there's been a decline. It's not prescription writing, it's prescriptions, but with other synthetic narcotics coming across the border, made in China, coming across Mexican and Canadian border. What about heroin? Heroin deaths are on the decline. Heroin with other synthetic narcotics continues to rise. What about cocaine? Cocaine deaths are relatively flat, but cocaine with other synthetic narcotics. What about benzodiazepines? Totally flat. Deaths due to other synthetic narcotics exponentially rising. These are not my statistics, ladies and gentlemen. This is from the USA Center for Disease Control in Atlanta, Georgia. Now, CDC admitted they made a mistake in 2018. I've never seen that happen. How does the CDC admit they make a mistake? Very quietly. What does the lay press do with it? Do not publish it. So actually in 2018, the CDC realized that when they were talking about opioid deaths where there was a prescription involved, they neglected to include the role of other synthetic narcotics. So it's not physicians who are killing patients, ladies and gentlemen, at an exponential rate. It's other synthetic narcotics. Now, how did we get there? How did we get there where Americans love their narcotics? Remember, we consume about 80%, 75% of all the narcotics in the entire world. Well, we have unrealistic expectations which are really founded by the lay press. They talk about pain in militaristic terms. We're going to beat pain, conquer pain. We're going to declare a war on pain. That was when Bush was president. When Obama was president, he softened it. Let's understand your pain. And of course, America has become the United States of America's Juana. And because Americans don't want to confront the issues related to addiction, we want a cure for our addiction. Give me something to inject myself every month so I can continue the ongoing use of my narcotics. Don't take my drugs away. Make me not become addicted to my drug. That's the American way of life. Then we sensationalize individuals who've died as a result of drug overdose. We make heroes out of them, big heroes. We made Michael Jackson a big hero. Vicodin, Dilaudid, Xanax, Zoloft, Demerol, Visceral, Paxil, Prilosec, and don't forget Conrad Murray, of course, giving him propofol, his cocktail of drugs. We sensationalize Whitney Houston's death. We sensationalize Prince's death. The guy who fell off of his airplane 2 days before his actual death, so intoxicated by fentanyl and oxycodone that he couldn't even stand up, had to be rushed to the hospital. And this is his last known photograph. So what about physician casualties? Here's a guy from New York, local guy, Martin Tesher, 83-year-old physician. He's a pill pusher. He killed a guy in Staten Island. He's going to jail for 20 years. He's a physician casualty of America's love affair with narcotics. How about this poor guy, Todd Graham, from my neighboring state of Indiana? Todd Graham, my age, practicing very good pain medicine, gets a patient, a new referral, who's got some musculoskeletal conditions, and she comes in with her husband and says, hey, Dr. Graham, I know I'm a new patient, but I've been taking oxycodone for 15 years. You got to give it to me. And Graham did all his due diligence. He said, whoa, I got to check the prescription monitoring program. I got to do an H&P. She goes, no. I just need my oxycodone. The husband's there. She's going to have a withdrawal, Dr. Graham. Give her her damn narcotics. Well, Graham says, no. Well, hold off here. You're a new patient to me. Graham didn't give her the oxycodone. Patient and husband went out into the to the parking lot. Graham goes out for lunch. Husband walks up and shoots Dr. Graham twice in the back of the head. He's dead. Physician casualty of America's love affair with narcotics. So what's the future? Well, this is America. The hammer falls. Somebody's got to pay. Just like El Chapo has to pay. And just like the other guy, Pablo Escobar, had to die, right? Somebody's got to pay for America's love affair with narcotics. The domino effect. How did it start? It started in May of 2019 with John Kapoor, the founder of INSYS. Really, the history of, he's got the American dream written all over him. 76-year-old guy from India comes in, he becomes a $875 million worth guy, creates this little company, INSYS, takes off. He's going to jail for the rest of his life. And several of his cohorts are too, because he misbranded the use of his narcotics. Totally appropriate. September 11th, 2019, Purdue Pharma is going out of business. Well, it's about time, isn't it? Purdue Pharma is long overdue for going out of business, and that's the Sackler family. Under this new deal, they're going to pay $3 billion in cash over 7 years. October 2019, drug giants close in on a $50 billion set. Why? This is America, ladies and gentlemen. Someone's got to pay for America's love affair with narcotics. In 4 states, $260 million opioid settlement for Ohio. How does that play out? 3 major drug distributors and an opioid manufacturer reached a $260 million settlement with 2 Ohio counties. Okay, it's against Amerisource, McKesson, Cardinal Health, and this company out of Israel, Teva. And this is from October 21st, 2019. Why? Because somebody's got to pay for America's love affair with narcotics. Now, there's a global deal that's going to be worth about $48 billion, including $22 billion that comes from Johnson & Johnson. Why? Because it's America. Somebody's got to pay for America's love affair with narcotics. So to finalize, and I'm sorry, I'm a minute over, we have to identify high-risk patients. We have to do comprehensive evaluations. We've got to do our appropriate physical examination. We've got to create realistic treatment goals. We've got to avoid the use of long-acting opioids at initiation, educate patients, and so forth. We're not going to solve America's opioid epidemic unless we start in infancy, in kindergarten, taking away children's belief that narcotics are somehow an American rite of passage. We've got to change the entire culture of this country. We will never make a dent in the opioid epidemic if we think we're going to send people to jail, tax the huge pharma industry, and kill physicians for doing their due diligence and their duties. Now, these two don't like each other, the Prime Minister of Canada and our President, and you can see that Trump is kind of chuckling here. Why is Trump chuckling? Because the Canadians have overtaken us in several of the use of the most powerful opioids, fentanyl, hydromorphone, methadone. The Canadians are now beating America. Go Canada. And so I'm going to leave you on that note. I hope that this has been useful and instructive. Try to do your job every single day. Don't take it to heart that people are blaming you for this opioid epidemic. We are not responsible in this room for creating this. This is an American problem. Alcohol, tobacco, firearms, faux fat. We are now faux fat in this country. It's a large and growing public health crisis. Prescription opioids since 2012 are on the decline. What's killing people are other synthetic narcotics. That's your take-home message today. Have a great morning. Have a great meeting. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Ken. Great background information. Next up is Dr. Florid, a good friend of mine and many of us from pain management and regenerative medicine of Jacksonville, Florida. He will be speaking to us about medical